The movie starts amid the chaos of a plane crash in Minneapolis where a commercial plane, a Boeing 747, hits another plane, which was a misrouted DC-10 mid-air. And when I say misrouted, I say that because technically speaking planes have traffic. Anyways, in the cockpit, the captain, Captain Rockwell, reports the situation to the air traffic control and asks his officer Ron Kennedy to go back and check on the extent of the plane's damage. Ron does so, only to discover that the passengers are all burned and dead, and he was incredibly shocked at the sight, but before he gets shocked even more, the entire plane blows up. In the next scene, the National Transportation Safety Board's investigator Bill Smith arrives in Minneapolis to investigate whether the crash was caused by a human error or the failure of the structure. So he flies over to the crash site with his team to investigate the carnage left by both planes, and at the site, they find out that a total of 619 passengers and 24 crew members were aboard both of the planes and that none of them survived the crash. They then meet the Nobel Prize winner physicist Dr. Arnold Meyer, who seems to have a curious professional interest on the accident even though he's a far cry from his area of expertise. So he admits his interest to Bill and that he's read several of the crash reports. Later, Bill questions the air traffic control operator Mr. Jans, who admits that there were only 3 of them working at the time and were completely overwhelmed by the number of flights. Bill and his team then go to the warehouse where all the carnage was being kept for inspection, and the DC-10 had its ticket agent serving coffee to help out all the investigation personnel. So Bill asks one of these people who were helping out, this blonde girl, for a cup of coffee, but she gives him a look and then runs away. And later, the team gathers to go through the cockpit tapes, and the tapes show the usual panic reaction that's expected to ensue in a crash, but they get stuck trying to understand the part where the first officer frantically yells that all the passengers are already burnt and dead. They get pretty confused, and there was a difference of opinion as to what to make of it, as the tape suggests that the bodies burnt before the actual fire took place, which was after impact. Then the blonde lady from earlier brings them coffee and they continue their discussion. The team then goes to a local gymnasium where all the bodies were being kept temporarily for assessment, and the pathologist informs them that most of the passengers were burnt beyond recognition and that the next of kin can only identify them using personal effects. But the strangest of all the findings that they made is that they found a couple of watches that run backwards, which leaves everyone mystified. Bill then holds a press conference trying to clear up as much of the confusion as possible, and the blonde lady was watching the press conference intently in the background when Mr. Arnold walks in and steals the spotlight by asking a series of questions about the incident. He asks if any unusual findings have been found in the investigation so far, and whether the crash might have been caused by something less obvious than a computer overload. He keeps asking if there were any unexplained observations, including in the cockpit recordings, or anything unusual that was found in the wreckage. Bill shuts it down by explaining that it's too soon to come to any conclusions about the incident and that they should be able to learn more in a few days' time. Later, as Bill leaves to go to his room at the Marriott, the blonde lady runs up to him again and introduces herself as Louise Baltimore and asks him out to dinner and then spends the night with him. During their very exciting escapade, Louise urges him to take it easy on the job and even goes as far as canceling his scheduled wake-up call at the hotel. So the next morning, Bill was obviously running late and promises to see her that night to talk about the possibility of going on a vacation together, but she warns him that she might not be there that night just before he steps out for work. And after a couple of feet outside the hotel room, he regrets the way he left it with Louise and goes back inside his room to smooth things over, but to his surprise, he finds absolutely nothing inside. So this really creeps him out, and he looks into Louise's identity and soon realizes that she was never part of the DC-10 ticket bureau, cause she was wearing one of the uniforms the first time he saw her and she pretended as if she worked there. So Bill then goes back to the warehouse to look through the wreckage once more, and a blinding red light gets his attention and he then picks it up to get a better look. So as he was checking it out, the light flashes and stuns him and he falls down. Then weirdly enough, Louise and 2 other ladies dressed in heavy uniform materialize out of thin air and they come to check on him. They collect the stunner and walk into a bright light called the Gate, which transports them into a drab machinery-infested world. There, the women are called, or should I say summoned, to explain what happened by their master Coventry, a really old and weird-looking person with bluish hue and very thin white hair, and he scolds them about potentially creating a paradox which will inevitably change history and also destroy them. A timequake, which happens during paradoxes, appears then to confirm his fears and forces them to try to rectify it by making sure nothing significant changes in the past timeline to change history. Louise confides in her personal robot, Sherman, that she didn't like interacting with Bill. It was the job of her her personal robot to shed light on what goes on inside the human mind, and Sherman explains that the reason she hated interacting with Bill was because, unlike her usual interaction with other people of the past, it wasn't around the premise of trying to help him avoid death. Then Sherman examines her physical condition and remarks that she hasn't been smoking enough, to which she replies by noting how clear the air of the 1980s was and how horrified the people of that era would be to see how worse the pollution gets. During this interesting discussion about the future, they're informed over the speakers that uniforms and hair for lookalikes will proceed to stage 2. So Sherman helps Louise prepare for her travel to 1963 by dressing her and quizzing her about the decade. As they were about to set off for 1963, Louise passes by her pet bird, who's no longer able to fly because of all the pollution and environmental changes that's affected its physiology, and she wishes that she could take it back to 1963 to watch it enjoy its freedom. Meanwhile, back in present day, Bill attends one of Dr. Arnold's lectures about time-traveling paradoxes, so the doctor defines the concept of time travel and stresses that even in the remote possibility of time traveling by humans, the time traveler has to be very careful as to not go back and change something so significant that will probably alter history. He goes on to explain that the possibility of paradoxes make people rule out time traveling by humans. He adds that the time traveler from the future could be certain that the planet will be destroyed by complacency and will have to live with the legacy of pollution and acid rain. The doctor assures his audience that their children's children will be barren and that the human race is going to go extinct. The doctor concludes his lecture by stating that the hard part about looking for time travelers is that they don't want to be found, so one must think to look for them in unexpected places. In the future, the time travel ladies set off to the 1963 mission. The ladies land in a flying airplane, looking and dressed exactly like hostesses through the gate. As they stun the passengers one by one to prepare to transport them to their world in the future, they notice one of the passengers watching them too closely. He soon takes another passenger hostage and demands to be taken to the captain. He shoots one of the time travelers, Susan, while she was trying to calm him down, and Louise stuns the shooter, and during the commotion, a young boy finds Susan's stunner, the one that she dropped when she got shot, but gets stunned himself by Louise before he can ask about it. They then use the gate to transport the aircraft to the future, and the crew help the passengers out of the plane while replacing them with soulless body replicas. Louise reminds them to leave the young boy as he was the only survivor of the 1963 crash. Susan admits to losing her stunner in the plane in the commotion right before she passes out, and Louise unsuccessfully tries to retrieve the stunner, which forces her to update the situation about the lost stunner to the council, which are disintegrating human parts kept together in tubes. They inform her the first stunner they lost in 1989 was in possession of Bill, and the second they lost was in 1963 has found its way to Dr. Arnold. They tell her to go back to 1989 and retrieve the stunner by preventing Bill from going to the hangar that day she met him. She first hesitates to accept the mission, but Sherman convinces her. Louise then goes back to 1989 to the day where she met Bill at the hangar, and this is when we go back to the original scene where Bill asks her for coffee and she runs away. Then she brings the coffee to Bill and everyone was gathered around listening to the cockpit recordings. Sherman then sends her an appropriate outfit to go out and flirt with Bill, and this is where she asks him to dinner. She then offers to drive to the dinner and goes incredibly fast that Bill was thankful to be alive by the time they got there. Over dinner, they get to know each other, and she tells him that she's not married because she can't have kids, and she doesn't want to get married as she thinks that the only purpose of marriage is to have kids. He then takes her to his room at the Marriott and they spend the night together, and she wakes up while he slept and goes through his luggage. In the morning, Bill was irritated that he didn't get his wake-up call, and when he was about to leave for work, she urges him to take it easy on the job, just like she did earlier, and she asks him to stay with her as she might not be there that night. He tells her that they will discuss it later and leaves, right after which she calls Sherman and asks him to send her the gate. So she leaves through the gate and the room is cleaned and organized as she does so, and after walking away a couple of feet from his room, this is when Bill goes back, but when he gets inside, he finds that she's not there. And as soon as Louise got back to her world in the future, a time quake takes place. She goes to the council as they monitor Bill's actions through a screen, and they see that he's getting unhinged and gets into trouble with his superiors. He goes in front of his bosses at the NTSB and reports that the crash was caused by a computer error, to which they decide to get new computers. He then gets emotional, describing what happened to him at the hangar and how he feels watched all the time time by the people that can go anywhere and see anything. He then goes to Dr. Arnold to discuss and compare notes, and the doctor insists that only time traveling is the only explanation that can explain the phenomenon, and goes on to show him the stunner that he found back in 1963. And things start to get a little strange from here when Bill shares that he was on that flight that crashed back in 1963, and it's revealed that Bill was the young boy and the only survivor of the 1963 plane crash in which Susan lost her stunner, and that he met Louise when he was just a young boy. And just as the doctor suspected, Louise shows up looking for the stunner, and she explains that she's from 1,000 years in the future where the extinction of the human race is inevitably getting closer. She tells them everyone is in terrible physical condition due to all the environmental changes and that none of the people can reproduce. So they came back with a solution in which they go back in time to hijack and snatch people that are moments away from a plane crash, then transport them to their future and give them a chance to repopulate the Earth. But then unfortunately, Dr. Arnold accidentally kills himself with the stunner and begins a paradox as Louise had feared. She rushes back to the future through the gate with Bill, and just as she gets to her timeline in the future, a timequake happens and the world starts crumbling down. The council decides that they should transport the people they've collected to a world further away from theirs before the gate is forever destroyed, and they do so while everything falls apart, including all the people from the future. Sherman then advises her to take a chance and go move to the next world with Bill, as she will be having his child. And as soon as they go through the gate, the entire world, including Sherman, unfortunately gets destroyed. And this is where this awesome film ends.